What's up, everybody? I'm Dr. Jordan Taylor, undergraduate exercise science program director and associate teaching professor at the University of Kansas. On today's episode of Fitness Facts, I've invited Dr. Andy Fry back for more discussion about resistance training and hormonal responses to various types of exercise, to various types of resistance training workouts. We also will discuss overtraining syndrome, which impairs performance in athletes and other individuals engaged in routine exercise. Dr. Fry is a professor in the Department of Health, Sport, and Exercise Sciences at the University of Kansas. He is also the director of the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab. Dr. Fry's research has consistently focused on resistance exercise, skeletal muscle physiology, endocrine responses and adaptations to exercise, and overtraining. So welcome back to the show, Dr. Fry.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
Well, Dr. Fry, they sent you over from hair and makeup, all ready for the chat today. And I heard him talking about how you may be the most intelligent former wrestler on the planet. So is that true?
Well, I don't know. Former wrestler, yes.
Okay.
Most intelligent, definitely not.
Now, when we say former wrestler, this was not WWF, WWE in the squared circle, the ring. This was actually on a mat, real wrestling, right?
On a mat, real wrestling, loved it. Wish I could still wrestle. Love watching it.
It gets in your blood. Well, you know, if you ever wanted to maybe move up in the ranks and join the WWE or WWF, I've got a good ring nickname for you.
Oh,
Want to know what that is?
Oh, no. I'm not sure.
Professor Payne. How about that? Would that work?
Well, my students maybe call me that, but, and you know, one gym over from where we're sitting, there's wrestling mats, you know, so after we film, we could.
Yeah, well, you know, we've got that
over.
room downstairs. What is it, 130? You keep talking about putting some mats down there, maybe some cages, having some cage fights amongst faculty. Well, anyway, all right, let's get into the topic. So, you know, in a previous episode, we talked about anabolic hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, IGF-1, those are associated with promoting muscle growth. You discussed how a resistance training workout can cause an acute increase in blood levels of those anabolic hormones. However, we didn't go into detail about the specific type of resistance training session that induces those acute spikes in hormones because, you know, not all training sessions are equal, right? So we know that the hormonal response to resistance exercise is dependent on the characteristics of the training session. So how does the design of a resistance training workout affect the acute hormonal response to exercise? And maybe if we just kind of got bullet point by bullet point here, let's talk about exercise selection. So if you compare a workout with a lot of multi-joint exercises, squats, lunges, overhead, you know, military press, deadlifts, bench press, those big multi-joint lifts versus somebody that's doing a workout that's primarily single joint, calf raise, bicep curl, tricep extension. What do you see as far as those the acute hormonal response?
Well, one thing before I answer that question, I will say that the topic of how important the acute hormonal response is being debated, not because there's not much data out there. There is actually, over the decades, there is a ton of data out there. There are a handful of individuals and labs that believe that the immediate hormonal response to your training session, to your weight training session, really doesn't mean anything. And I couldn't disagree more, but the listener needs to be aware that that is an issue, and you may hear about it on social media or in other places.
There is some controversy, even in the new National Strength and Conditioning Association texts that prepare students to be personal trainers or strength and conditioning specialists. It's written in there that there is a debate about that in the literature. But like I said, this is your area.
Yeah.
So,
well, and the topic, like a lot of topics, is it's hard to study. It's challenging because there are so many variables that the researcher wants to and needs to control. But in the real world, we also have to consider what's being done in the real world. Back to your question as to what exercises are known to cause a large hormonal response. in its most simplest level, your core, multi-joint, large muscle mass exercises have the biggest impact.
Right.
And when you think about it from a biomechanical perspective, those are the exercises where you do the most work per unit time.
Right.
And that's one measure of an intensity measure. How much work do you do per time? That's a measure of power.
Right.
And so in this case, if you are doing a barbell squat and you're doing 3 sets of 10 and say it's a maximum effort for 3 sets of 10 versus let's train almost the same muscle mass with leg extensions, leg curls, and maybe some kind of a back extension exercises. And there are devices out there. This is actually based on data that we have published recently. So 9 sets versus 3 sets, but in the squats, you're hitting all the same muscles that you're hitting on those 9 sets, and you get just as much of a hormonal response as you do doing 9 sets. So if I want to get, I can get whether it's looking at the testosterone or the cortisol or the growth hormone, large muscle mass exercises are much more efficient in general, which doesn't mean don't do small muscle mass isolation exercises, but just know that it's a different stimulus, and so that is probably the simplest answer to that.
All right, and so you kind of hit on this, but we'll get into loading because you talked about max effort. So if we talk about load or intensity with resistance training, typically coaches, athletes, anybody that's in the gym is going to talk about a load that they're lifting as a percentage of their 1 repetition max. So what do you see with the acute hormonal response if you look at comparing light loads versus moderate to heavy load training?
So this, I would encourage any listener to go back to some classic studies by Kramer et al. And a lot of this work was done at the Army labs outside of Boston, Massachusetts, the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine, and where many different training protocols were looked at. And the military was interested because they want a very efficient training program.
Right.
And one way to look at it is, like, among other things, what's going on with the physiological, or in this case, the hormonal responses. And so the question as to what kind of load was one of the issues that was being looked at. And they found that the heavier loads, and when I say heavier, in that particular project, it was a 5 RM load, the most you could handle for 5 reps, versus a 10 RM load, the most you can handle for 10 reps. So anyone who's done any lifting knows that, well, 5 RM, I can handle more weight.
Right, that's about what, 87% of your 1 RM, I think.
Maybe
somewhere around
something
there.
like that, give or take. And there's a little variability between individuals, but and they found that, for example, the heavier the loads, testosterone appeared to be influenced by that. The largest testosterone responses were in the program variations that had the heavier load. Now, you say, well, then why don't I go 1 RM or 2 RM? Let's just do a max load.
Right, every set. Yeah.
The problem there is, at some point, and when we talk about overtraining, we'll get into that. But also, you just are not doing enough work.
Right.
Because work is, how much work do you do also influences your hormonal response. And that influences things like the cortisol response, certainly the growth hormone. Yeah. Growth hormone is interesting because it's called growth hormone. Everyone associates it with getting bigger.
Right.
And if you look in the medical literature, an individual who has impaired growth, like a child who has a growth hormone deficiency, and you begin giving them growth hormone replacement, it has profound, dramatic impact on their maturation and their growth. However, growth hormone is way much more than just growth. It is a huge contributor to energy availability. Yeah. And so, and so now, as you look at what's the role of some of these hormones, if I'm doing more work, okay, that makes sense that there would be a larger. Now I'm getting into a different topic, but how much work you do is related to the intensity, the relative intensity, how heavy compared to my maximum, what percentage
Right.
of my max or what RM load. And so there's a lot of other factors, but in a very general sense, we tend to get a little bit more testosterone response when you are going relatively heavy.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting you talking about growth hormone and the other roles it plays besides just like, longitudinal bone growth, skeletal maturation, a lot of those things. I know in my exercise biochemistry class, we talked about, with my students how in many cases bodybuilders are abusing it because it has lipolytic. It has, like you said, fat releasing properties to it. It helps enhance fat loss, and it's abused, I know, in those circles for that reason as well. So it is an interesting hormone, but like you said, most people just think about for growth. Let's move on to rest period lengths between sets. So, short rest period, 30 seconds, 60 seconds versus longer rest periods, 3 minutes, 5 minutes between sets. How do those rest period lengths affect the acute hormonal response?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, it depends.
Yep.
And I told you I was going to use those
Yep.
words quite a bit. Because so many factors, whether it's the load, whether it's the rest interval, whether it's the total work, whether it's the which exercise, how much muscle mass, so forth, they're all interrelated.
Right.
And they don't exist in a vacuum by themselves. So the question of rest interval is also tied into, the fatigue that you develop. It's also tied into, am I able to recruit the right motor units in my muscles and have a quality workout? So some of this comes back to what's the purpose of your training. Right. And, if I'm a competitive power lifter, say, for example, or a competitive weightlifter, I want to have enough rest between my sets so that every set is very high quality.
Yeah.
If I'm training,
I know there's some data out there that, typically you're lifting those heavier loads, your 5 repetition max or lower number of reps, that is, with a heavier load. It can take anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes for, I think it's around 80% of that phosphocreatine, the phosphagen system, the ATP PCR energy system to be replenished. So yeah, if you're cutting your rest period short, thinking, well, maybe if I have a little shorter rest period, I'll get a more acute hormonal response. Well, you may not be able to do the subsequent sets as heavy. And so then, you can see how that may then impair your overall strength gains down the road. It's like you want to typically be, if you're a strength training athlete and your goal is strength, you want to be able to do each set with a maximal effort, and you have the energy stores in that phosphagen system recovered. So I cut you off, but I think it's important for people to know that if you design a resistance training program, don't just focus on, well, what do I need to do with the exercise selection and the load and the rest period length and the volume and all that to get this acute hormonal response, because that hormonal response and its role is debated. Plus, there's other factors that lead to gains in strength and muscle size, right? Besides just that acute hormonal response, right? So obviously, protein intake, mechanotransduction, the actual load that you're using and how that stimulates some of the intracellular signaling pathways that switch on muscle protein synthesis, like mTOR and things like that. So it's not just about the hormonal response, although it's obviously important.
Hey, give me this question list. I'm going to start interviewing you.
No, let's go skip ahead to the next one.
Well, no, let me jump in there, though, too. You bring up a great point. I'm thinking right now of a paper by Matuzak, Journal of Strength Conditioning Research, that was looking at how much recovery is needed between 1 rep max strength testing squats, barbell squats, in well-trained lifters. And some of this is based on, say, what a competitive power lifter experiences. Sometimes they have to follow themselves. It depends how the meet is run, but they may have a very short turnaround time between max lifts. And it's also based on what you're saying. you need to allow a certain amount of time for the ATP, the phosphagen system, to replenish.
Yeah.
One
Like
thing
filling up your gas tank. It's got to
Yeah.
refill between sets.
And one thing to keep in mind, though, too, in the example I'm talking about, we're just doing one rep. And yes, there's ATP. It does impact that energy source, but you're not depleting it. So it's not like, wow, I've emptied the tank. Now how long before I fill it back
Right.
up? But what Matuzak found was if you, and these were people that had been, their one rep max had been tested multiple times. So we knew what a consistent level was. It was a stable measure. And we looked at 1 minute recovery, let's do it again, 3 minutes or 5 minutes. And it had no significant difference on the ability for them to come back and do it again, which says, oh, okay, well, they had plenty of time to regenerate the ATP sources. On the other side, though, if you think about it, yeah, but that's not what you do in a workout. 1 rep and then 1 rep and I'm done.
Right.
You're doing a lot of, so being able to restore your energy sources adequately is a factor. And if you don't,
I don't know
then
any
it
power
influences
lifter
the
that rests.
load.
I don't know any power lifters that rest 1 minute between sets.
And so for them, it's a thing where if they got to, nowadays they use a round system, quite often they use a different system. But Olympic weightlifting, that sport, the weight on the bar just keeps increasing. I make a lift, I may follow myself. And that means I have a quick turnaround. And so some competitive lifters, I may not train that way, but I better be ready when it comes contest time. But the good news is you're okay. It's probably a big psychological factor, and get your game face back on, because you got to turn around and do it again, and in short order. But that rest interval is interesting because if you take short rest intervals, that's one for sure way to drive the growth hormone up, to increase the cortisol response. On the other side, it brings the weight down. And but maybe that's okay. If I'm a bodybuilder, I'm less concerned about that. If I'm if I'm training for a sport, let's say the sport we're talking about, my favorite, wrestling, you say, well, I need to function in a fatigue state.
Right.
So you say, well, I'll do that in the weight room. A possible argument, the other side though, is I function in a fatigue state every time I'm on the wrestling mat.
Yeah.
So I'm already taxing that issue as far as my metabolic capabilities in fatigue state, but I'm never ever on the wrestling mat focusing on maximum strength and power, which I can in the weight room.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I designed my old lifting program, if I went back in time and did it over, I'd have more of an emphasis on I wouldn't worry about driving my lactate up in the weight room.
Right.
It kind of depends what your purpose of your training program is.
Well, that's tough about the sport of wrestling or MMA or any of those sports. It's like you've got to have the muscular endurance, the strength, a little aerobic endurance and conditioning in there. And it's so hard because it's different training approaches to improve in all those different domains. So it makes it tough. And I think one other thing I want to mention, you mentioned that study looking at 1 minute, 3 minute, or 5 minute rest periods, and that was in trained individuals. So this is another thing. If you're reading any type of scientific literature and you go through and look at the methods, are they trained or are they untrained individuals in that study? Because maybe you're an untrained individual, you're trying to get started with your program. Well, you're not going to be able to apply some of the results or conclusions from that study if they were trained to yourself, because you're untrained, and so the responses can be different. And I think that's important for people to look at anytime they're, or maybe you're a student that's looking at a couple different studies. Were they trained or untrained individuals? Because you can't extrapolate the results, from the untrained group to the trained or vice versa. Okay, do you agree with that?
Yeah, give me this question thing again. You're right. You're stealing my thunder, but you're absolutely right. That's often overlooked.
I'm just filling in the gaps,
Yes,
That's
you
all
are.
You're running the thing. I'm just, filling gaps, right? Patching holes. That's all I'm doing. And then now volume. This is the last, I guess, variable as far as within an exercise bout. So let's talk about the volume during a training session. low volume, and when we say volume, we mean the total number of sets and reps that are completed in a workout session. So we look at low volume versus high volume. You're doing a lot of sets, a lot of reps. What do you see as far as the acute hormonal response?
Well, some of that comes back to, in some ways, similar to the rest interval question. The more work you do, the more critical bigger the metabolic demand is. So growth hormone is goes up more with higher volumes, and cortisol does as well. And so, when you think about, and you mentioned, the simplest measure of volume in the weight room is what's called volume load. Your repetition,
I left the load part out.
The simplest measure is just how many repetitions are you doing. But it's kind of like if you're a runner, you say, well, how far did you go? Well, I ran 3 miles. Well, you ran 3 miles too, but we didn't run at the same pace. And so that is a big factor.
Right.
So on one hand, we both did the same volume of work, but other factors come in to affect the response. Same thing, I can just count the total sets and reps, which tells me a lot. On the other hand, are they leg press or squats or deadlifts or large multi-joint, large muscle mass exercises, or are they wrist curls and calf raises, which can be very hard and difficult and challenging and uncomfortable, but you're doing a fraction of the total work.
Yep.
And so you can look at volume load, how many reps times the weight that you're actually moving. And then the biomechanist would say, well, let's also look at the work, which is force times distance. So just because I lifted a weight, you and I may lift 100 pounds, but you lift it at twice the speed I'm lifting it, well, you're generating more force. And so you actually you're doing more work, assuming we went the same distance. So there's different ways to look at volume, but the greater the volume, or the more demand there is metabolically. And the greater the volume, that means the load is less, which means that would at some point impact, to some extent, a testosterone response. And let me also say this. That doesn't mean there's not a testosterone response. It means it comes down. It's just a little bit less. And so it's not like something's turned on or off. It's black or white. It's up or down. It's like all these things kind of interact with each other, and the responses tend to come down or go up slightly.
Yeah, it's like you mentioned the first episode we did together, how it's like a mobile above an infant's crib. It just, everything's trying to fluctuate a little here and there, but stay in balance. All right, so I think we've hammered that home. Let's talk about some differences. Moving on to, how do other factors such as sex and age affect the acute hormonal response to resistance training sessions? So if we look at young versus old, male versus female.
So let's start with the age issue, and for this answer, I'm going to focus primarily on the male response. So with aging, there is a natural decline in certain hormones. There's a natural decline in testosterone. Okay, so at my age, without even measuring it, I know that my testosterone is less than it was 30, 40 years ago, period. And so that doesn't mean it's gone, but it means that's a normal effect of aging.
Physiological response.
And, we have data on older, say, master's age weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters that were still active and actually very successful, lifting some very impressive weights, but well into their 50s, but their resting level of testosterone is less. And these were in a drug-tested sport, so we can verify they weren't being supplemented with a performance-enhancing drug. And so what was interesting, though, was in this particular case study, they got an acute response to testosterone that was pretty marked. Which means, okay, the ability to generate testosterone was there, but their resting levels were less.
Right.
And, and that ties into
Now,
sexual.
was that acute response the same as, say, a young, or was it blunted a little bit? Do you remember?
It actually was the same as young, because the comparison group was junior national squad. These were the top young lifters between ages 15 and 20. Some of them still maturing, but they had normal, healthy testosterone levels, or what you would expect. And this older gentleman now he had been continuously training all the while since he was a teenager.
Right.
So we're talking
Very
30,
well trained.
30 plus years, 30 to 40 years of high level training, a 2-time Olympian, etc. So the ability, it's possible to get an acute response. Now, the person who decides when they're 50 or 60 to take it up, I'm not sure
Right.
what would happen. I would suspect there would be an increase, but know that you're starting from a different level.
Right.
Related to that also is growth hormone. So growth hormone is, they call it a peptide hormone. So it's made of 181 amino acids. So it's a chain of amino acids. And the 181 amino acid is kind of the standard, the basic growth hormone. And when you buy an assay kit, when I say an assay kit, in our lab, if we walk downstairs, if we have a blood sample, we can analyze for growth hormone, and almost all of the assessments are looking for 181 amino acid version.
Mm-hmm.
However, for years it's been known with aging that your growth hormone levels decrease. In fact, there's plenty of studies that show, wow, it's gone at some point with aging. Which is interesting, because if a young person just stopped having growth hormone, you've got a medical problem. Right. And that's why they'll do growth hormone therapy, hormonal replacement therapy. But with aging, it's not like I need to go. I'm 66 years old. I don't know. Maybe we'll go measure my growth hormone this year when we do a study. I don't have to go out and get replacement therapy. Well, what's going on? It's now known that there are many variants of growth hormone. So that 181 amino acids, it can come in different forms. It can be sliced, and some of those portions don't do anything. But some of them are still bioactive. They have an impact. Yeah. But those assays don't recognize those. They're looking for the original. So in our studies, we have to say we're looking for immunoreactive. The antibodies recognize it. But now it becomes more complex, because it's like there are a whole bunch, as in dozens of other variants, which means they're probably doing whatever job most of the time. So then the growth hormone response, I probably don't, you would, depends what you're measuring. So again, it depends.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like growth hormone, it made me think of IGF-1, since Dr. Fry's talking about growth hormone, which is released from the pituitary in the brain, and then that can signal the liver to release insulin-like growth factor, IGF-1. There's also variants of that. For instance, I know that's created like within muscle, you have, mechanogrowth factor is a variant of IGF-1, and that can play a role in...
Well, and I'm glad you brought up IGFs, the insulin-like growth factors. There's, and in the older literature, they call them somatomedins, somatomedin C and so forth. So if you really find this topic interesting, you should go back and read the older literature, but also the names change. So it's confusing enough. Let's change some names. But when you look at IGF, and what's often done is we will take it from the blood, and we'll run a test and see how much, for example, IGF-1 is circulating, and that is growth hormone, as you said, is a major signal for that in the circulation. But these IGFs, they're not just in the blood. Right. They're also in the tissue and never get in the blood. So it's like, so what's that doing?
Because I've seen some literature debating, well, is it IGF-1 from liver that's really upregulating muscle protein synthesis and stimulating muscle growth, or is it the mechanogrowth factor that's in the muscle tissue, maybe acting in an autocrine or paracrine manner, being released from a cell, binding to the receptor on that same cell or a neighboring cell, and that's stimulating then the pathways inside the cell that promote the muscle
Yeah.
protein synthesis and growth.
And for your listeners, if it's endocrine, we're talking about something that gets in the blood. If it's autocrine, it never leaves the cell that it started in.
Yeah.
It's produced there and it just stays right in its own neighborhood.
Right.
And if it's paracrine, it just goes to the surrounding area and again doesn't get in the circulation. And so that means how do I interpret what's in the circulation?
Right.
Because the
It's like,
analogy.
does it matter if there's an autocrine or paracrine response going on with what's in the circulation?
And the analogy we use in our lab, it's like looking through the keyhole into a room. So we're in this big room at 75 feet by 35, 30-foot ceiling, but I'm looking through my keyhole and I see one person over here and I think that's all that's in the room.
Right.
But in reality, there's a lot because, so it depends how you're testing, what you're testing, and but are the insulin-like growth factors and related compounds like the mechano growth factor, are they important? Yes. You take it away, and you get an impaired response. And there's a mountain of literature in the endocrine world on this stuff.
Yeah. Okay, and then it's the last one on this point: male versus female acute hormonal response.
Well, that is, comparing the sexes is interesting because it's often thought that, for example, people think, well, women can't gain muscle size. Well, baloney, they can. They'll say women have, give or take, maybe 10% of the testosterone a man would have. And that's their own natural production. For men, it's primarily from the testes, but from the women, it's primarily from a portion of the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex. So women do have testosterone. They do produce, there is a slight increase with exercise, but it's much smaller. Some of the hormonal ratios that we commonly look at in men, you can look at in women. The numbers are different, but they respond in a fairly similar manner. One thing that's interesting, this comes from the work of one of our former students who's now a professor out of Cal State Northridge, Dr. Justin Nicole, and he's published this in, I believe it's the journal Steroids, and looking at the differences between men and women for the receptors for testosterone.
Right.
So these receptors are the little compounds that it's like the electrical outlet in the wall.
Right.
That's like the receptacle, and I'm trying to put the electrical plug in.
Right.
And so testosterone is looking for its receptor on the target tissue. So in muscle, they actually see that even though women have 1/10 of the circulating testosterone, they have about, I forget if it's 1/4 or 1/2 the number of receptors. So compared to men, they've got a lot more receptors
Yeah, that
out there.
ratio is
And so
different.
it's like, okay, well, how many of those receptors have testosterone actually bound to it? And in his work, there's a way you can get the muscle sample and you can determine how many of those receptors actually have testosterone bound to it. And he found out that, wow, it kind of equalizes out. It's not that big a difference when it gets right down to the muscle.
Right.
Now, why then aren't women just as big as men? Is it during development? And there's other factors going on. Most likely those are factors. However, it's, the female physiology has adapted to where, testosterone is important.
Right.
Response. Is it the most important? Is it the biggest thing? Probably not, but it is a player in what's in your response to training.
Now, and I'm trying to remember, I think I've come across this in the literature. It is true. Is it true that androgen receptor content, and again, that's the receptor we're talking about here for testosterone, DHEA, these other, androstenedione, these other derivatives. is the androgen receptor content greater in the upper body of males, upper body musculature of males versus females?
You know, the data that I'm familiar with is talks about upper body of males being more sensitive for growth.
Which could lead, that's, you see where I'm going with this, is like, well,
Yeah.
does that explain why, or is there a correlation there with then why males tend to have more upper body muscle mass versus a female? But
You know, and I'm not familiar that specifically has been looked at, but it's well known that among men and women, men carry a greater proportion of their muscle mass. You know, if you think of the entire muscle mass a man has, a greater percentage of that total is in the upper body compared to women, where a greater percentage of their total is not in the upper body, it's in the lower body. And
especially you guys that don't do legs, so train your legs. Right?
That's right. That's right. And so, so some of that is, there are some differences. Now, is that due to androgen receptors? I'm not sure. I wouldn't say yes or no. That would make sense, but that means, okay, let's get some samples and let's start looking at it. And the other thing about androgen receptors, and so this is the the testosterone receptor. Historically, the school of thought is these receptors, and we're talking skeletal muscle. So let's go to the muscle fiber, the muscle cell. These receptors are not in the membrane, they're in the cytosol. Mm-hmm. So testosterone is a steroid hormone. Well, steroids, all their precursor compound is cholesterol. Mm-hmm. And so it's lipid-based, and it can pass through the membrane, which is unlike other hormones. It can go in and it binds to its receptor in the cytosol, in the fluid component of the cell, so it's already in there, and then it gets transported to the nucleus and it affects the genetic machinery, etc. We now know it's not just that simple. Mm-hmm. There are a ton of ways. In a recent review by Kramer and Radamus is fascinating, because there's a wonderful diagram that really shows, like, I forget if it's 8 or 10 or 12, it's like 10 or 12 different ways that testosterone, there's receptors in the membrane, there's the fact testosterone can bind to non-testosterone receptor, it can bind to cortisol, it can affect so many different places in the cell that it's not just, okay, how many receptors are there? That's a big factor, but there's so many other ways it can influence the muscle cell, which makes it more complex. But then that also makes sense why it's not just a one simple answer. Your body is pretty complex, and I know one school of thought is, well, the simplest answer usually is the best answer, except we have a very complex system here, and so
nothing's working
depends.
In isolation.
Yeah.
Well, we'll move on to the next here. So, assuming a properly designed resistance training session that actually elicits an acute response in some of these hormones we've talked about, how long do those different hormone levels typically stay elevated post-exercise? And maybe talk about how they may stimulate muscle growth.
Yeah, so now we're talking, the time, there's a time issue. We're on this timeline. I do the workout, I stop the workout, but then I have my recovery time. And so, one, that's a great question. It depends to some extent on what hormone or neurohormone you're talking about. For example, if we're talking about the catecholamines, so epinephrine or norepinephrine, also known as adrenaline or noradrenaline, boy, they show up quick and they disappear quick. Their half-life is measured in seconds. Boom, they come in, they do their thing, have a massive impact on all kinds of physiological systems, but boom, they're here, they're gone.
Yeah, and you know that inherently. If you're in a scary situation and, well, your heart rate jumps up, your your eyes dilate, you start sweating. That's that
Yeah, so
response.
the example, it's never happened to me, but I know when you're driving down the road, Dr. Taylor, and you see the red lights in your rearview mirror, and you get...
It's my lead foot. It's real heavy.
But that kind of thing where it's like, it's not me, I'm okay. But it's a very rapid response. Some of it's neurological, but the catecholamines are really part of the sympathetic nervous system. So it's related to the neural response. But your steroid hormones, for example, they quite often when we measure after a workout, we'll measure them at least 5 minutes after, because it takes a little bit longer to get into the circulation and to see the response. And some people will measure it maybe 15 minutes, but you begin to run the risk of missing the peak if that's important. And so depends on the hormones. Growth hormone, we often will measure 5 minutes after. So if we're doing a study and you're a subject in the study, you're right over here next to us doing the workout, we have plenty of time for you to rack the bar, walk downstairs to our wet lab. We'll do the blood draw down there 5 minutes after you rack that bar, and we're good to go. Right. If it's a catecholamine, we have the setup right next. You rack that bar, and the chair is put under you, and we get it. We try to get it within 15 to 30 seconds after you're done. And so, the length of time that you have elevated hormones varies. Now, once you finish a workout, though, you don't just, and I'll use the catecholamines as an example. It's not like you go back to your resting level. They come down quickly, but you actually have an enhanced metabolic response for a number of hours after your workout.
Right.
And some of that is, the catecholamines around a little bit longer. The steroid hormones, though, people, Jim McMillan, who is, I forget if he was at Auburn at the time, and this is going back a few decades, looked at 24 hours after one experimental weight training session and showed that, you're back to normal. It's not like a day later I'm elevated. It lasts for a little while after, but after a few hours you're back down.
That made me think of something too, because there's a lot of literature out there indicating that muscle protein synthesis is typically elevated anywhere from 24 hours post-workout to maybe 36, 48, and that's your window, and when you should really be eating and recovering and getting in enough protein to really repair and rebuild your muscle tissue so it can grow. So some people will say, well, if your hormonal response is already way back down, at 24 hours post-exercise, well then, you've still got muscle protein synthesis maybe occurring 24 to 48 hours later. So does it play a role? You'll have those people that argue, they'll argue that based off of just how long muscle protein synthesis is elevated post-workout. It's longer versus the hormonal response is a shorter period of time on that post-exercise timeline.
That's a really good point you bring up. I like to, if you go on social media and you see people who put the dominoes in line so they can knock them over, and it's it's a chain reaction. I think you can think of some of these physiological systems the same way. So you may get a hormonal response that is not the only thing going on, but it causes something to happen. And which causes something to happen, which causes something to happen.
You said it's priming the cells. There's a lot of things going on there where it doesn't have to match up exactly with the timeline of the muscle protein synthesis response.
And that becomes an issue, like, and I don't know if we'll get into it today, but some of the signaling pathways in muscle. Well, which signaling pathway and which protein signal are you looking at? Because for this protein to be activated, this one has to be activated first, which activates this one, which activates that one, and so the timing, it's not all at the same time. Now, what is the time frame? That's a good question. It probably depends on the workout, the individual.
Are they trained, untrained?
Yeah, a lot of things like that. And in fact, our colleague, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Nicole, he's actually published stuff, or it may be in press right now, saying that pre-workout energy drinks, which are loaded with caffeine.
Yeah.
Now, is it the caffeine? Is it something else in the pre-workout energy drink? We're not sure. But the people that got that, it sped up the cascade of cellular events. It looked like, whoa, they were further along, which makes sense physiologically. They had they had a much bigger catecholamine response, etc.
That's why you get so much work done in your office, right? You're always ahead of everyone else because you're
drinking coffee.
just in there chugging energy drinks.
Yeah, so this is my energy drink, and so there is a physiological basis for it, but the timing is not everything happens at the same time, and the protein, the protein.
mTOR.
Well, no, you were talking about not the protein degradation, but the protein.
Muscle protein synthesis
yeah.
response.
I was drawing a blank there. The muscle protein synthesis, that's further down the road. That's almost the end product. But for an athlete, the end product is
what matters.
One, if I'm a bodybuilder, am I bigger? Or if I'm trying to put on weight, am I bigger? And or am I performing better?
Right.
Actually, I for sure want to perform better. And in a lot of cases, I may want to be bigger. In other cases, I may not. But that's kind of the end product.
Yep.
And these are all just steps along the way.
Right. Yeah, it makes sense. The hormones would be elevated, and the downstream signaling pathways and the actual building of the muscle from all these hormones maybe switching signaling pathways on in the cell. That's going to happen for a longer period of time later down the road. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the naysayers who say the acute hormonal response has nothing to do because look, we measured the hormone here and we didn't see an effect on your 1RM bench press. And it's like, there are so many things going on in between. The other thing is you have to look at the study designs. For example, an 8-week training program where one training session in the middle, they took a pre and a post-workout blood sample and said, look, that had nothing to do with what we saw at the end of 8 weeks. And it's like, well, no kidding.
Didn't have enough samples.
It's like, of course it didn't. It doesn't.
Right.
It's not even a good design. And so I believe their numbers, but I disagree with their interpretation.
Yeah. So I'll mention now, inside the cell, in response to resistance training, amino acid intake like leucine, other amino acids, that can switch on this little intracellular switch called mTOR. It's an enzyme. And when that gets switched on, that can signal the ribosomes, which is a cellular organelle where proteins are actually made. And then those newly made proteins can be incorporated into the sarcomere, the muscle tissue. That mTOR gets switched on by a variety of things. So we know, certain hormones, IGF-1, testosterone, they can switch on mTOR as a result of those hormones binding to the receptor. Like I said, the leucine, other amino acids can switch on that enzyme that promotes muscle protein synthesis and growth. But what other signaling pathways inside the cell get switched on and have some of the doc students looked at here, where some of these hormones play a role in switching on some of these pathways? Because again, there's so much crosstalk. It's not like, maybe talk about AKT, which is upstream of mTOR, some of the other molecules inside of a cell that get switched on.
Yeah, the last few decades, this area of study has exploded. And the technology has improved that has allowed us to look at it more readily, and also some of these pathways are relatively newly discovered, as in the last few decades. So then trying to figure out, okay, what is it that turns on these signaling pathways? Now, and what also makes it complex, it's not one path. Right. It's kind of like looking at the New York subway map. It's like, gee, which road do I take to get down to Manhattan? Okay, I got a lot of different routes. It's actually even more complex. It's like looking at a road map of the U.S. I want to drive from here to Wichita. Well, I can take, I can go over to Topeka and head down. I can go south and cut over, a
lot of dirt Ottawa. Roads too.
I can take every single section road. So, it's like, and I can get down there. It's just, what's which road gets me there.
Right.
And so it's a little bit like that. And So we look at a number of pathways. You mentioned mTOR, which has been implicated as being a key signal in how the muscle cell responds to a stimulus. And so it can get turned on or turned off or modified in a number of ways. And in a very general sense, at a very basic level, it can be phosphorylated. So you have these inorganic phosphates that are all over the cell, and they can bind and cause something to be upregulated or downregulated. So it works both ways. It's like the gas pedal in your car and the brake pedal.
Right.
I want them both.
Yeah.
You know, I don't sit there with my feet pushing on both at the same time,
Right.
but I can regulate the speed of my car.
Because there's another molecule like AMPK switches it off.
Yes, and so you know, what is one stimulating or is one inhibiting? Some of the signals that we look at are the MAPKs, mitogen activated protein kinases, and it's a family of 3 MAPKs: ERK, extracellular regulated kinase 1 and 2, ERK, P38, which is based on its molecular weight, and JUNK, JNK. ERK is, and I'm generalizing here, is thought of as an anabolic agent. P38 is a stress-activated MAPK, so sometimes it's called a SAPK, stress-activated protein kinase. And then JUNK is kind of funny because it's typically also called a stress-activated protein kinase, but we see at times it is part of the anabolic signaling too, so it kind of can go both ways. Those can get activated, and they in turn will come over and influence what mTOR is doing. So mTOR is one path over here, and I've got these MAPK paths that come over and either influence mTOR or influence factors that are downstream of mTOR. So, but they definitely influence what's going on there, and we see what, you know, part of the ongoing question is what kind of workout stimulates which of these signals, and which one, and I do want, you know, you think, oh, I don't
how
want
can you
this.
optimize the upregulation of these pathways that promote the anabolism, the muscle growth, and performance benefits? And
one common misconception is the stress response. Ooh, that's bad. I need to limit that.
I was going to get into
Yeah, so maybe I jumped the gun here, but it's kind of like people think, oh, I don't want a cortisol response. That's a stress hormone. That's bad. It's like, no, your body has it there for a reason. And it's part of the normal response to a stress. I go in and I work out aggressively. That's a stress. And it may be a stress. So stress is not bad.
Right.
There is, you get into stress physiology or some of the early work of Hans Selye, who developed the general adaptation syndrome. There's good stress, which is eustress. There's bad stress, which is distress. But I need that stress response.
Right.
I do not want to buy a car that doesn't have a brake pedal.
Yeah.
I want to have that system that kind of like, slows some things down, and it's the combination of the two. So you have the MAPKs, you have the AKT, which signals mTOR, you have all the signaling proteins that follow mTOR, and some of them, you know, and there's all this crosstalk, which makes it more complex. And I haven't even talked about a bunch of other pathways. But what's interesting is all of these pathways can be turned on by a mechanical force, the mechanical tension or force that's developed in muscle. And remember, muscle, one of the basic functions of muscle is to change shape to produce force.
Right.
That's what a muscle cell, that's one of the key things it does. And so that muscle force that's produced is one way to signal these pathways. It's affected by metabolism and metabolic signals. It's affected by sympathetic activity. My catecholamines, my adrenaline, my epinephrine can
think
influence
about,
that.
somebody that's in a, maybe, I don't know, trapped underneath a car, their leg, they were changing a tire or something, the car dropped down on it, and they have such an acute, huge spike in those catecholamines, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and they're able to produce just enough force, which they probably normally wouldn't, but they're in the situation where their leg's stuck. They can, lift it up just enough to slide their leg out and get away. So
it's the classic fight or flight response, which, on one hand, if I'm participating in sports, I get a lesser version of it. The example you gave is like a life and death situation. But it's football. It's almost kickoff time, and you're on the side. You're running out for the initial kickoff. It's fight or flight. Here it comes.
You're geared up.
I walk out on the wrestling mat. Okay, here it is. What's optimal arousal and so forth. What's also interesting is these signaling pathways. For example, the MAPKs, they interact with what we talked about a few minutes ago, the androgen receptors. And they help to regulate the activity of the androgen receptors, and they can actually turn them on by themselves even when testosterone is not around. So now, okay, let's add another layer of complexity here, and yet the system works, and it works well, and we're still learning how they interact. So it's not a one simple answer.
Yeah. Well, since we mentioned, and this is my next question, my next topic of discussion is cortisol, because it is widely thought of that, right? We've talked about all these anabolic hormones that are associated with promoting muscle growth, the testosterone growth hormone, IGF-1, et cetera. Now, cortisol, we know it does promote proteolysis, or the breakdown of proteins, in muscle cell. For instance, if you're fasting or you're stranded on an island and you haven't eaten for a week or two, maybe nothing but a few bugs, you're going to lose fat, you're going to lose muscle mass also, because a lot of times what your body's going to do in that situation to keep your blood sugar levels elevated is break apart intramuscular proteins, and this is due to cortisol basically signaling the muscle to do that. You release the amino acids from those proteins into the blood, they travel to the liver takes some of those amino acids and can create glucose out of them to keep your blood sugar level up. Right, dump that newly formed sugar back out into the bloodstream, so you've got sugar going to your brain and your kidney and your vital organs to keep those functioning, because your body's not concerned with keeping muscle mass on. It's trying to regulate the amount of energy in the form of glucose in the body to keep your vital organs going, so you can stay alive until you hopefully find a wild animal to eat, or some berries or whatever. So people think,
where do you live?
The boonies. Western Kansas is where I'm from. So, but anyway, it's like, if you think about it, so people look at that and they say, oh, well, cortisol is bad, that response, like you said, because it breaks down muscle tissue. But maybe you can get into how there's all kinds of muscle proteins. It's not just actin and myosin filaments. Maybe you're breaking down other proteins to help rebuild the actin and myosin filaments that actually produce force inside of a muscle cell. So it's like, just talk about how protein breakdown induced by cortisol in this acute exercise response is not always necessarily this bad thing, even though people think it is. They're like, oh, you got to blunt cortisol. You don't want any cortisol.
And this I learned from my mentor. I studied under Bill Kramer, and a term that gets thrown out there sometimes, I think inappropriately, is muscle damage. But what you're describing is what I would call tissue remodeling. So there is the constant turnover in healthy living tissues. There is a constant turnover and remodeling of anything. Even bone. Bone is living tissue, and it remodels according to the stresses that are applied to it.
Red blood cells, a lot of examples.
Anything, and so you have any living tissue. So you have a constant turnover, and part of what we're doing when we go in the weight room or we go out onto the practice floor or arena is I'm providing a stimulus that my body is going to adapt to, and it's going to remodel. And so now you've got this going on, which, yes, I have protein breakdown degradation, but it's not muscle damage. Muscle damage is an injury. It can be very severe. In its severest forms, it can lead to rhabdomyolysis and kidney problems, etc. But lesser forms, I go in and I do a really aggressive workout. Oh my gosh, I can't. I haven't squatted for a while, and man, I can't. I have a hard time walking around for a few days. Well, if I'm an athlete training for a sport, that has now interfered with my sport training.
Right.
And so, but if all I'm doing is weight training, and that's fine. You know, I don't mind being sore for a few days. That's part of the process. That's okay. It's not necessarily interfering, but I certainly don't want to cause a muscle injury.
Right.
And so, muscle remodeling is a continuum from no stress to such severe stress I have to be hospitalized.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about somewhere in here where there's remodeling going on, and at some point it becomes muscle damage or and delayed onset muscle soreness is somewhere in the middle here. But believe you me, no matter what you do, there will be some remodeling going on. And cortisol and other compounds are part of that process.
Right.
And that's a healthy,
right.
normal response that if I don't have it, I'm back to my car without a brake pedal.
That's a good explanation. It's like it's important, just the take home message, to realize there's no bad, good hormone. They're all important, right? So they all play a role. So now moving on to the next point, because we've talked about these acute hormonal responses. Does long-term resistance training, so if I've been doing this for say a year, does it alter my resting hormone levels? Like if we're going to draw my blood fasted in the morning, 8:30 a.m., 9 a.m., does that year of training, is it gonna alter things?
There's a really good sports scientist over at the University of Jyväskylä in Finland, K.O. Häkkinen. And Häkkinen has done tons of resistance exercise research and tons of endocrine and neuromuscular research. A long time ago, he was working very closely with the Finnish national weightlifting team. And they actually documented over a 2-year period where their resting testosterone significantly increased over that 2-year period. Now, before you jump to conclusions, yes, it was a statistically significant increase. It was very tiny,
right?
But it was real. Now,
so is it physiologically relevant, right? It's like, the stats show it.
Which is a good point. So does it, and what does that mean? And again, you also, and they, as best they could, because these were actively training athletes, training for competitions. We know that different phases of your training cycle, as in your sets and reps and, your periodization program, they can influence your resting hormonal levels. Mm-hmm. They tried to control for that as much as they could, and because they were working with the coaches, they could. So on one hand, could it? Yes, for that hormone. But on the other hand, it's hard to, it's not like, boy, that goes up and down, just based on long-term training.
Maybe subtle changes.
Does the program influence it? Sure, because we see things going on with stressful training. We see things going on when you taper. So let's back off and let's taper right before a competition. You definitely see differences. But the ability to change with time. Now, what also is a factor is if I'm, say, either untrained or only moderately trained versus I am a highly trained. And when I say highly, like say this Finnish national team, what is it they do? They're as close in that sport to a professional athlete. That is what they do. Mm-hmm. And, they've dedicated their lives to it, and they're supported by the government, et cetera. Okay, they're able to do a different amount of work and work at different loads.
Right.
And the quantity and the quality of work that they do is different. So their acute response could be different. And you definitely see differences in, say, the epinephrine response to exercise, not necessarily in this group, but it's long been known that as you become more trained, you get higher levels of epinephrine, but you use it more efficiently too.
Right.
So it's both. I get more efficient.
Yeah, it's on the front and the back end.
Yeah, and so that's a great question, but it's probably more affected by the training program.
Right. Okay. We'll move on to the next one. So we've talked a lot about the androgen receptors. I think everyone understands what that is, again, that's like you said, the electrical outlet that the hormone, which would be the cord, is going to plug into to signal various things inside of a cell to happen, like stimulating muscle protein synthesis, growth, like that, adaptations in the cell. Does resistance exercise upregulate androgen receptor content?
I am trying to think, because there's several studies out there. Barry Spearing, who was with the Army for a while, and I'm trying to remember where he is now. He's done research that has looked at the acute response of the androgen receptors. Forget the phosphorylation status and is testosterone bound to it. He's seen changes in the content in response to exercise. I know there's other work that came out of, I forget if it was at Baylor or prior, where they've also looked at the effects of repeated workouts in subsequent days and seen the effect of exercise on testosterone, on androgen receptors. So is there an effect? Possibly. Based on some other stuff we've talked about, it may be what state that receptor's in.
Right.
And as the field progresses and the testing technologies improve, we're able to decipher, okay, is it just the total amount? Where are they located?
Yeah.
What's the affinity of, in this case, testosterone for it? Are other things like these signaling pathways influencing the affinity or the activity of these receptors? And are they in the membrane? Are they in the cytosol? Are they, what else is going on? It might.
Yeah.
It's most likely a transient thing.
Yeah.
But I would say, it's still an active area of research.
Yeah, and it could make sense if it's you could theorize, well, if it's a transient thing, receptor content increases. That's just because if testosterone's increasing too, well, now you got more binding sites for it. Yep. So I guess in one sense, in one manner of thinking, it makes sense that okay, you got to have more binding sites to deal with the acute increase in testosterone, right? Because it's like we've talked about before in the first episode. It's not just about blood levels of hormones. It's like they have to have. If you think of them as a boat, there's got to be a dock for them to pull up into and hook up with, for it to work. All right, so let's change pace now and let's talk about overreaching and overtraining in athletes or just people that are engaged in routine training very frequently. What is the difference between someone that's reached a state of overreaching versus overtraining? Maybe just kind of defining what those terms are.
So I've spent a lot of my career looking at overtraining, and in particular, I've looked at it with resistance exercise. And I think that overtraining, one, is an overused term. Does it exist? Absolutely. If you are in a classroom and you ask how many people here have overtrained, you get a huge number of hands that go up. Oh yeah, I overtrain. I think though, that you need to look at this whole thing on overtraining as this big continuum. So over here versus over here. Over at this end, my left hand, this is good training, normal, healthy. I'm making good progress. I've put a great program together. Over here is overtraining at the other end of the spectrum. And there's actually American College of Sports Medicine and the European College of Sports Science a few years back came out with a position statement on overtraining and overreaching. Initially, it was to help clear up the terminology and define what it is. And then a few years later, they came out with a subsequent statement that was saying, what's the state of the research? Where are we research-wise? What do we know about overtraining and overreaching? Well, also, let's think about this. If you think about just training in general, well, what kind of training? Am I a marathoner or am I a shot putter? Am I a competitive weightlifter or a bodybuilder? Am I training for a sport? I'm a basketball player, I'm a wrestler, I'm a track athlete. The metabolic demands are from one end of the spectrum to the other. The types of training are from one end of the spectrum to the other. The adaptations are from one end of the spectrum to the other. And with good training, they're all good adaptations, but they're very different. And that's why the shot putter trains very differently than the marathoner. And so what are the characteristics that occur for an overtrained marathoner? Well, it's, good training, the characteristics are quite different. Bad training, the characteristics are quite different. So you can't lump overtraining into like what's the signal or what's the red flag that, yep, you're overtrained, with one exception. If performance has gone down and it's due to poor training, and, if it's gone down because I had to run my race in bad weather, okay, that's different. If I'm lifting on a lousy bar and the platform's got holes in it, okay, that's different. Or some other factor. But if it's something where my performance is down and it stays down for an extended period of time, and it takes a long time to recover. If I'm a competitive athlete, I'm in trouble. We'll take one of your favorite sports, football. If it's game 6 of the season and it's like, darn, I think I may have overtrained. I am just flat and my performance is down. That's messed up your season, because by the time you come back, season's wrapping up. And so it can be, it doesn't kill you, but it kills your season. And so now I've got to back off. So the fact that if performance is not depressed for an extended period of time, when you allow for recovery, that's probably not overtraining. However, most of what's going on is somewhere in between perfect training and this overtraining. And so in there, we tend to call that overreaching. And that's where, okay, my performance is either stagnated or it's gone down, but I can come back pretty quick. Give me a little break. A good coach says, all right, you're just a little off, Dr. Taylor. Let's back you off just a few days.
I'm a lot off.
But say it's my team. I just had a football game. It's like, wow, I thought we'd do better this week. We were just flat. Maybe one strategy is we're going to back off a little bit this coming week. Doesn't have to be a ton, but we won't beat the hoo-ha out of you and let you recover. And there's plenty of examples that a good coach knows anecdotally because they're attuned to this. But then as a sports scientist, we want to understand, well, why? What was the stimulus that created it? What was the result? But then what's going on physiologically, psychologically, biomechanically?
And I think that's where it's important, for anybody that's going to be a strength coach, trainer, you're working with folks, especially like during the season. It's very important, if you're a strength coach, to be communicating with the coaches, with the players about how they're feeling, and looking and seeing if there's drops in their performance, maybe in the weight room. Are the workouts too frequent? Are they too long? Is there too much volume? All those factors that can lead to overtraining. So you got to figure out, well, how do we maintain, their level of performance that they've achieved, in the off season, because typically more frequent workouts. If you're in a team sport, greater volume, greater, in some cases, intensity. Me personally, I'm for keeping load and intensity high if we're talking about lifting during season, but cutting the volume and frequency back so that you don't get into overtraining. But those are variables that strength coaches got to tease out. So performance isn't dropping down, especially like you said with football. If you're getting into the playoffs and things like that, the last thing you want, and guys are banged up at the end of the season, is you've got to make those manipulations to the program so that performance isn't declining right when you're getting into the most important part of the season. So, why does, and I guess I kind of got into, I'm stealing your thunder again. Gosh,
I know.
Guess
I'm going to step out of the room. You go on without
me. I just need a good whipping, I guess. So why does overtraining occur in athletes or other individuals that are training routinely?
Well, one thing I think, and I don't have data on this is my opinion. I think when you self-train, it's perhaps easier to overtrain because you're calling the shots on yourself. And in some ways, that's hard to do.
Right.
And it's easy to get into the old adage that more is better. And wow, I'm kind of flat in my performance. I need to bump it up a little bit. I'm not doing enough. When in reality, maybe what's needed is to back off and allow recovery.
An example of that, I just thought of it, but anytime people at the beginning of the new year, January 1, you see this huge flood of people coming into the gym because they're going to, get in shape. They've got these New Year resolutions, and they just go, I mean, for lack of a better term, just balls to the wall. I mean, they're just all in those first couple weeks, probably doing way too much. They've never even, they haven't exercised or trained for years. And, I mean, I think that's an example right there of someone that's just doing too much too soon.
And it's, in a perfect world, you've got someone to direct you. Well, that's the coach or the trainer, the person that knows that there's sometimes that you will get pushed and you'll get pushed hard. And there's other times when we're backing off. And you don't have to go, you cannot go 100% every single time.
Yep.
You can't run race pace every single day. You can't have a football game every single day. You can't, so you have to design your program around that. Another factor too is difference between team sports and individual sports. That brings that's a challenge. Like an individual sport, you're measured by the tape measure or the stopwatch or something like that, where it's pretty clear what's happening with performance. A team sport, what if your offensive or defensive line on the football team? What if their coach has been overworking them and boy, they're just kind of flat? But it's hard to tell because is it because I played a really, really good team and we weren't going to beat them anyway, which you don't want to go in with that attitude, or is it, well, this was a team that we should have been able to hang with, but now we're a little bit flat. So I mean, and it's a complex sport anyway. There's so many things going on. And so I think, and what level are you? Am I just training for fitness? Well, some people get, even though they don't compete, but they are diehard. You hear about people that have a training addiction. On one hand, it's good to be dedicated. On the other hand, it's like, it's like that
they're
is
going
their
in
life.
Sick, working out. They got a fever. They're still in the gym.
I can't miss it. And and so that's an issue. And so there's so many factors. Another thing too is, am I involved in a sport where, and I'll just zero in on strength and conditioning or in the weight room. There's some sports where that is what you do. I'm a power lifter. I'm a weightlifter. Maybe I do. I guess you could throw CrossFit in there, although that has other things besides weightlifting. But it's that related kind of sport, or a bodybuilder. What I do is in the weight room. It's not like if I'm a power lifter or weightlifter, it's not like, okay, I've finished my weight room session, I'm going to go off now and do my team practice, because that's not part of it. And so, but say with a team sport or my weight training is a part of the bigger package, and as important as it is, the most important practice is to get to the football practice or baseball practice or whatever. And so how do I make that work? I can't let what I do in the weight room interfere with what's going on the practice field unless the strength coach and the sport coach have coordinated it. If you're my strength coach and I'm the baseball coach and I know, well, Jordan's going to be really working on pretty hard on Tuesday, so I'll plan my baseball practice accordingly. There has to be that communication, but lots of times that doesn't happen.
Well, and I think of in so many sports, like you said, giving examples. I've got a buddy of mine out in Denver that's a professional MMA fighter, Austin Osmosis Jones, and we talk sometimes about his training and nutrition and things on the phone. But it's like, I think about somebody like that with MMA, where you have so many things. He's got grappling to do. He's got the sparring, the striking. He's got aerobic, cardiovascular endurance training, muscle strength training, so lifting, muscular endurance. I mean, making weight. I mean, there's just so many factors, and it just seems like in a sport like that or wrestling, like you did, it's like trying to maintain this optimal state of functioning. It just seems like it's more easy to get overtrained in those types of sports when you have so many variables. And if that program isn't periodized correctly by a strength coach or a trainer, someone that's working with that athlete, and they don't know how to, for instance, as the fight's approaching, yeah, maybe you're doing more grappling and sparring, but you're tapering down the weight training and the, a little bit on the aerobic conditioning, but you're less weights, maybe more fight specific, like I said, grappling, striking. And if you don't have to taper all that, well, then you run into some pretty significant issues come the day of the fight.
And I think something else to consider based on all the data that we've run into. Initially, in our laboratory research, we said if we're in the weight room, what is our criteria for being overtrained? We said, well, your max strength goes down. I mean, why not? That makes perfect sense.
Right.
Over a number of years and a number of studies, my belief has changed based on our data. Strength is one of the last things to disappear. When we have just measured how much can you grind up through, put a heavy load on. And this is we don't do our overtraining, overreaching research with untrained people. We can't. I mean, it's not even a smart question. It's like people that are already fit, already in good shape at a critical level. They're not elite. We couldn't do this with an elite athlete. In fact, they shouldn't participate in one of our studies because these are, we're challenging, we're creating an overtraining environment. But strength hangs on. We began to realize, I think power is more sensitive, and that starts dropping off. Well, then when we look more and more at power, we says, what's really even more sensitive is speed.
Yeah.
So now, I don't have data on this, but it makes me think of the post football or basketball game interview with the coach. My team just got beat, your team beat me. And in my interview, I'm like, I don't know, we just didn't have any zip today. We're kind of flat.
Guys weren't moving like they usually do. You kind of hear that.
Now, there could be a lot of things that contribute to that. On the other hand, it's kind of like, did we not overtrain the athletes, but did something go on somewhere in their preparation for that game where they hadn't recovered enough? They were a little fatigued, just a little bit off. Is it from the weight room? Is it from their sport practice? Is it from something else that's going on in their lives, whatever? Is it during finals week if I'm a collegiate coach or whatever? That's why they don't schedule basketball games and stuff during finals week. That's like the worst thing that you could do. But they're just, you lose your speed. And we've got data on, well, how much do you lose your speed? You lose, in our data, which has been pretty extreme, but in just a few weeks' time, we've lost 0.2 of a second on a 40-yard sprint and 0.11 seconds on a 10-yard sprint. Well, if that's your athletes and you're in a speed sport, well,
I think of the NFL, that's going to affect your draft position. You go to the NFL Combine and you run a 4.5 instead of a 4.3, and they thought you were going to come in and run a 4.3. Well, 4.3, you might have been a first, second round pick. And then you turn out a 4.5, and it's like, and it's all because you might have been overtrained. Yeah.
And I will say this: even though we did have some good sprinters in our group, and people that had played at the D1 level in speed sports, but the training program was really, really extreme. So I mean, it was way out there. But let's cut those losses, the decrease in speed in half. Okay, it's only 1/10 of a second. That's still terrible.
Right.
Or 0.05 or 0.06 seconds. That's still terrible. I'm still this far behind after the first couple steps, and now the receiver's open.
Yeah, people don't realize, they don't understand that, like a difference between a 4.3 second 40 and a 4.4 second 40 or a 4.5. That's several steps at the line. So it doesn't sound like much, like, 1/10 of a second or 0.2 of a second, but it really is.
And this is in the text that we talked about last time. A decrease of 0.2 seconds in a 40 is over 1.5 meters difference at the finish line, and it's over 0.5 meter difference at 10 yards. And so, I mean, just to put it in context, that's
right.
I'm this far behind, and if I'm the coach that prescribed the program that did this. It's like, and I'm coming to you and I'm saying, well, the strength is okay, and that's true, but the speed is really
Right.
sensitive, and so
Speed
that's
and
something to
power
keep
are
in mind.
sensitive. That's
Yeah,
interesting. Yeah. And that's really sad too, because if it is a player that is normally a 4.3, runs a 4.340, and they somehow that program isn't periodized right, and they turn out a 4.5, man, you talk about affecting their draft stock. That's
yeah, yeah.
not good. All right, so how can maybe talk about in the lab versus how coaches. So in the lab setting, how can overtraining be detected? What are some common markers, some signs, symptoms that you see in athletes or individuals that are overtraining? And then what might a coach look out for with his athletes or question them about to see if they are overtrained or not?
Well, I think there's there's a number of things that can be done, and I'm not going to talk about what we would do in the lab, because I mean we study the circulating hormones, we look at motor unit recruitment and the activation of muscle, we look at the biomechanical characteristics of an activity, we look at the catecholamines that really go nuts, and we look in the cell. Okay, that's fine, because we're trying to figure out why. What the
Right.
heck is, or not just why, but understand how come what's contributing to that decrease in
Right, and
performance.
so many systems can be affected. It's like the cardiovascular system, the endocrine, inside the muscle. I mean, overtraining can affect, a
So, but
lot.
some of the more applied things is, and a good coach does this anyway. They don't have to,
Right.
they learn by their experiences. Is communicating with your athletes and knowing your athletes. Now that becomes a problem. I'm a high school coach and I got 80 football players on my team.
Right.
How do I know everyone? Well, I've got some assistants, but that every assistant's got 20, athletes they're working with.
Right.
Or, there's college football teams that, especially at, some of the small college levels, they have huge numbers on some of these squads. And it's not just football. So how do I get to know my athletes? That is so critical. Same thing at the job site. You'd like to think your boss knows you and communicates with you a little bit. Same thing in the classroom. As a good teacher or professor, do you know your students? That's hard when you have 200 students sitting in a big lecture hall. It's this next semester, I'm going to have a class with about 6 or 8 in there. It's going to be awesome.
Right.
The communication will be different. So at times I've had the opportunity, the great opportunity to just kind of like be a fly on the wall when I've seen some national level coaches interacting with their athletes, and it's very subtle, but they talking to them, communicating with them, creating a relationship. So then you open up the lines of communication. An athlete should be comfortable saying, I'm just not feeling it today, coach.
Right.
I'll give you 100% effort, but it's just flat. There's also some things too that whether you're in the weight room or out on the practice floor or field, when you see performances just being a little bit off. Now that doesn't mean you're testing all the time, but some of the drills just don't look as sharp. You can do things like velocity-based training, put a little sensor on the bar, and it's like, this load, last few weeks, this person's been moving at this velocity and they're a little bit off. Was it because, we had 3 games this last week and they were all on the road and there was an overnight trip and we hit a snowstorm and got delayed
Not sleeping, not
and it's
recovering.
midterms and they broke up with their girlfriend or boyfriend, whatever it is.
Right.
And so there's a lot of factors. So are there some measures that are just built into the practice that performance is just a little bit off? Maybe it's the coach's eye. I can detect it. And it's like, I think it's maybe it's the attitude, the energy that's in the room.
Yeah.
When you're dragging and boy, there's not a lot of energy, is that, hey, we need to punish them and make them work hard, to make them, it's like, or is it like, maybe I have to modify my program. I thought we could handle it. But, and if you're in season, you don't get to control the competition because
Right.
you got to go with whatever the contest is dictating. So I mean, those are that's not very scientific, but I think it's really, really critical. And the whole psychology of it, which is what our KU Sport and Exercise Psychology Lab, they help us with this kind of stuff. There's some simple questionnaires, as long as they're validly answered and honestly answered, which means the athlete trusts that you're going to use it, not to identify, oh, you lazy son of a gun. Instead, it's like, oh, I want to know this.
There can be, like you said, I know those are some markers, mood changes. If they're overtrained, I know that can sometimes impair sleep quality.
Yep.
But also, it's funny because you need sleep to recover. But yeah, overtraining can impair sleep. I know, they're just not as motivated to go through a training session or perform. Alterations in like resting heart rates in the morning. I know that can be one indicator. Maybe it's higher than normal in the morning or lower than normal. Like you mentioned, the catecholamines. If you were going to measure in a lab altered levels of epinephrine, norepinephrine in the blood, testosterone and cortisol ratios. So maybe testosterone levels are lower, cortisol levels are higher, and you have that altered ratio as a result of overtraining. So I think there's a lot of interesting things. Now, obviously, a coach isn't going to be drawing blood and measuring some of those things, but the more practical things like, hey, are you getting enough sleep? Are you having trouble sleeping? Maybe a bunch of your athletes they just tend to keep getting colds and infections and respiratory. Now, it doesn't mean that's because of overtraining, but it could be. It's something to think about, right? Guys are just getting sick. They're missing practices and games. Are they doing too much training? Is it too frequent, too much volume?
So
Mood.
one of the things is you mentioned there's so many factors that go into this. So then the coach needs to say, okay, was the problem created by my training?
Right.
And if it is, then you're in a good position because you can control it.
Right.
I can dial that down and make corrections because none of us are perfect and we miscalculate or whatever. But also, maybe your training was like, no, this was well designed and should have been good, but there's other things going on that we didn't think about, and that you do not have control over. And so I can't go and take away, if it's a collegiate athlete, I can't take away your final exams. If it's a personal thing, I can't go in and change your family dynamics or get you back together with your spouse or whatever. I can tell my guys don't go partying and so forth. Hopefully that's not part of the equation. So we'll throw that one out. You got good athletes; they stay the course. But even in that case, there's some things that I can't control, but you still can control the program that you're prescribing. So it's like, all right, this is not what I wanted. This is not ideal, but I need to titrate back what I'm doing to allow, and plus some individuals, are different. So it's interesting. And also you have to realize this does not mean that stressful training should never be done.
Right.
That's part of a good training program. Just knowing,
a healthy amount of stress.
I can push people hard, but I also know when to back them off.
Right.
And I know that more is not always better, and more intensity is not always better. And also just having good communication and knowing your athletes is absolutely huge.
Okay, we'll move on to the next one. So are the signs and symptoms of overtraining different between those athletes or individuals that are primarily engaged in aerobic endurance exercise versus individuals that may be overtrained as a result of anaerobic resistance exercise? So your sprint, speed, power athletes versus, say, your cross-country runner.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the early work in overtraining, just like a lot of the early work in exercise science in general, was done with aerobic athletes, endurance, individual endurance exercise. In the world of overtraining, there's two terms you may come across. One is called sympathetic overtraining, and one is parasympathetic overtraining. And those terms have been criticized because there's some basis to that criticism in that you have your sympathetic nervous system, you have your parasympathetic nervous system. So if you're talking about the heart or your heart rate, when your heart rate increases, that's sympathetic input.
Right.
When it goes down, like a well-trained endurance athlete, their resting heart rate's down. That the parasympathetic is predominating and bringing it down. So it doesn't mean that that's what's causing the overtraining, but there are some symptoms that tend to occur, and that's why they call it sympathetic or parasympathetic. Right. With endurance athletes, there's been evidence for a number of years of what's called parasympathetic. And so the general rule of thought is an endurance athlete does such a volume of work that
all the miles of running
that the parasympathetic has taken over. Now, for the longest time, they said, I've got my normal system. I start doing this huge volume of distance running or some aerobic. And the theory was your sympathetic system kicks in and tries to maintain performance, but eventually can't, and it gives out, and parasympathetic takes over, because they would find an already overtrained distance athlete, and boy, the evidence said this person has a predominance of parasympathetic activity. The problem was they weren't able to measure this person as they progressed through. They'd get them at the end. Right. So they didn't know the journey to get there, and that pattern was theorized. And what's tricky with a distance, say a cross-country runner, if that's you, and you mention morning heart rate, one of the signs that people say is, oh, if your morning heart rate starts going up a little bit, you may have a problem, because I know it tends to be right around here. All of a sudden now it's up a little bit. Oh, we got a problem. But parasympathetic, you're seeing the other.
You see it down.
And you see, okay, well, isn't that what's good with endurance exercise? I can decrease my resting heart rate. The issue here, though, is these are already highly, highly trained people doing massive amount of work, and that additional decrease in this case is not good. So on the surface, it's like, oh, even better, but no, it's not better. Now, to your original question of, say, the anaerobic athlete, like a lifter, and so in some of the studies we've done, which I remind you again, were not good training programs. It was like too many max lifts, sets of one, maximum load. So every lift is at or near one repetition maximum, 100%. And yeah, that is problematic, but we did it to try to study what's going on and track it. We saw the first evidence of a sympathetic response. And so you had a bigger epinephrine response, adrenaline, and our theory was your body's trying to maintain performance. I'm having some trouble. Let's crank it up a little bit. And with anaerobic athletes, they can't do, or my belief is, they can't do the volume to drive themselves into parasympathetic. An endurance athlete can. An anaerobic athlete runs into problems before they get that far, and their performance becomes impaired, or orthopedic issues come up. Which is a different thing.
The breakdown of connective tissue, ligaments, tendons.
So now I'm not able to get all the way into parasympathetic. But it makes sense physiologically. It makes sense from the type of training they do. The positive adaptations with good training are different for these two athletes. And the maladaptations from too much is also a problem. And so, it depends. You've got different signs and symptoms. And that some of the hormonal ratios you talk about, that does not necessarily mean you're overtrained. It may mean you're going through some stressful training, but it always comes back to performance. If performance is not impaired, then am I overtrained? These other things may be markers or warning signs, but I'm not overtrained if performance hasn't been affected.
It's like, don't make assumptions by association. So just because you see a increase in cortisol in the blood, decrease in testosterone, but their performance is still great, or they're even performing better, Well, you can't assume that just because that ratio is off that they are overtrained, because the evidence is no, they're not. They're performing just fine.
Yeah, and and this was an interesting study on a simulated wrestling tournament. 5 matches over 2 days, just like being in the winner's bracket on a major tournament. 3 a morning, afternoon, evening on day 1, morning and afternoon being your championship bout. But the hormonal ratios, as you went through, were just going down, 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 down. Was that person overtrained? No.
Right.
They're wrestling very successfully. It's just kind of a tournament is stressful.
Right. Yeah.
So that's why, okay, we'll back off for a few days before we're not going to turn around and go in the gym and hit it even harder because, oh, you lost the finals match.
Right.
Let's pound it. It's like, no, let's recover. And, a good coach knows that.
Well, and it's like a good example, I guess I think of is like Lance Armstrong, and I've talked about him in classes, but, Lance Armstrong's heart is so strong, his stroke volume, the amount of blood he can eject with each beat, and his cardiac output, which is, how many liters of blood you cycle per minute. It doesn't have to beat as frequently as at rest as like maybe someone like us where, we're not as aerobically trained. So I know they had talked about Lance Armstrong when he was competing, like his resting heart rate was down around like 28 or 30. And the average resting heart rate of an individual that's not aerobically trained might be 60 to 80, somewhere in there at rest. And so his is half of that. But again, it's like, well, that's an adaptation to all the cycling, the type of training he's doing. His heart doesn't have to beat as often per minute because it's ejecting so much blood with each beat. So it's like you have a training adaptation that's beneficial, but then when does it become so low that it's overtraining? I guess it's like anything you said. It's complex. It depends. It's hard to tease out. So yeah, a lot to look at. All right, just a couple questions left. We're wrapping this up. So how long, if someone is truly overtrained, how long is performance typically impaired? How can an athlete or a trainee recover from the overtraining? How long does it take to recuperate? What approaches would you recommend to promote recovery? So yeah, I guess we'll just start with how long is performance typically impaired?
Well, if you go back to the position stand I mentioned from ACSM and the ECSS, that was one of the issues is, when is it overtraining and how long of recovery? Kind of in a very general sense, if it takes minimally weeks, but more like months to recover and get back to where you were, okay, that would fit the definition of overtraining. But that still doesn't mean lesser versions of that aren't problematic. If I'm getting ready for the Big 12 championship and I'm not overtrained, but I am a little fatigued and it may only take me a few days or a week to recover.
Right.
Yeah, but I missed the time I'm supposed to peak for.
Right.
So that's something, yes, I can recover, but maybe that was, in an event like that, that's the target date and I need to be ready for that. In its mildest forms, I'll use, my experiences in the weight room where I'm, lots of times a Friday workout, I'm not my sharpest. And lots of times I like to do a little more, I go longer, but, that's not when I'm trying my new maxes or I'm pushing myself just because and over the years, I kind of, just personally, I gravitated to where I typically didn't train on a Saturday or Sunday unless there was something.
Maybe you missed a day during the week or whatever.
Possibly, and when I was trying to be a bodybuilder, I would sometimes do that. But the difference between my Friday workout and then I come in on Monday, just those 2 days was huge.
Right.
And you come in and you're fresh and you're sharp. And, if I were smarter, I probably would try to make it a little more even across those, my training week, if it was 5 days.
Right.
We also saw that in our overtraining research, where we push people hard every day, but we gave them Sundays off, because who wants to come into the lab on a Sunday, They come back Monday, and it's like, okay, they hadn't recovered everything, but their performance was like whoa, that one day was huge in some
Right.
of these projects we did, and we realized, okay, getting the recovery is huge, and all that was, it wasn't anything special other than you don't have to come in for a
Right.
day. At the other end, I mentioned if it's months, and there's data, some interesting classic work, I think, out of Manfred Lehmann's lab, Jürgen Steinecker now, I think, leads that lab over at Ulm, Germany, where they had very aggressive middle distance runners do a huge volume of work over a month. And some of those subjects weren't back to where they had been a year later,
Oh my gosh.
which is, wow, it's like, they said, we don't want to do this study again, but
Right.
it was a phenomenal study as far as looking at, so what happened.
Gosh.
And the sad thing is what they did is not that different from what some people do. And so, and they were all good runners, and they were still all good runners, but they weren't back to where they'd been. And
Man, a year of performance.
and so
decrement.
you hear stories like that, and are there some underlying medical conditions? Typically, if I'm overreached, it may take a week or two of me to come back and get back to where I was. So the example I used earlier, you are flat after game 6, and it's like, maybe I'm your coach. I say, Jordan, we're gonna limit your playing time this week. Don't feel bad. You're still our defensive back or whatever position it is you're playing, but we'll hold you out just a little
Right.
bit from some of the drills. We want you fresh. Don't think that
Yeah.
we're
And
cheating you or
it's hard. Athletes need to be honest. Be honest with your coaches, because it's hard if you're an athlete to dial it back. I mean, you have this mindset of pushing forward. A lot of athletes, more is better, but it's like, yeah, you dial it back if you start to have some signs and symptoms of overreaching or maybe overtraining.
And where this becomes, in some people's eyes, problematic, and this has been an issue, for example, in the NBA. So you get some premier prominent players that either, I don't know if it's in their contract, whatever, but it's, I'm going to sit out this game. Well, dadgummit, I just bought a ticket. I want to see the the team play, but they're not. But their star's not playing. On the other hand, yeah, but you look at the crazy schedules.
82 games, yeah.
And you look at what's metabolically, baseball is quite different. But we've talked about my son who plays minor league ball. They play pretty much minimum 6 times a week, and it's like, it's just, when do you have a day off? And on your day off, you're probably traveling.
Right.
So it's not just sitting around relaxing. And after a long, at some point, and that's where a coach, a few years back, here in Kansas City, we have a tremendous catcher, Salvador Perez. He caught almost every single game one year, and I don't know the details, but I suspect that caught up with. I mean,
right.
Catchers get platoon. That's why, and that's just part of the plan. And if anyone gets platoon, pitchers do.
Yeah.
Because you can only go so often. You have to allow recovery, and so there's not one single answer.
Right.
But it is a continuum.
And what approaches, just I guess in general, obviously rest, backing off either training volume or intensity or frequency, a lot of things you could tweak with the program. Any other approaches that you would just recommend to promote recovery?
Well, and this gets into the area of the other Dr. Fry who runs the sports psych lab, mental skills training, being able to, leave your game at the game, leave the practice, not,
right.
And so, I mean, there's the mental health side, I would also say, in sleeping and eating, I've heard it said, good dietary habits don't make a champion, but poor dietary habits can ruin a champion. Yeah. Well, that on one hand is that, and somewhat oversimplification, I'm sure, but there's probably some truth to that. Yeah. Backing off enough, because we ran into this when we actually were looking at an overreaching scenario with a collegiate football team, and we worked closely with the coaching staff. And in hindsight, we looked at the training program, and they had lighter days and heavier days, and it fluctuated. But one conclusion was they didn't back off enough. If you're going to have a recovery day or a lighter day, don't be afraid to hit the brake pedal harder. It's like, oh, we did a few less sets. No, maybe you need to really bring it down, and that's okay. And so it's like maybe more fluctuation and variation rather than just a little bit.
That was kind of my last point. My last question was just discussing the importance of periodization. And, that's obviously going back to the strength coach, the trainer who's ever working with these athletes. Is there anything you would mention on just basic tips to ensure that the program is periodized properly, that you have those fluctuations and variations, just to ensure that the athletes aren't going to be overtrained?
Well, one is putting together a well thought out protocol, program that has all the players at the table. When I say players, who else is part of this athlete's life? The sport coaches have to be there, the strength coaches have to be there, the medical staff, athletic trainers, team doctors have to be part of the equation, the dietitians, the sports psychologists, whatever, they all have to be part of the equation so that you have coordination there. And that's hard. Some
Especially
people call
at the
this
younger levels, like high school, or I even think in like rural western Kansas. I mean,
well,
that's...
And then you also get, and I've seen this at the high school level, so I have my sport practice, and my sport coach says, we're going to go in the weight room, and we're going to lift, and we're going to lift hard because that's how I did. Okay, so I got a weight training session. But you also are in the weight training class during the school day. So I just went through a weight training session.
Right.
Okay, and in the case I'm thinking of, I know what went on in the classroom. I'm not confident what went on because you got a person that's not trained in weight training adding it in. And then mom and dad have a personal trainer that they go to, that they send the young athlete to. So now there's another level because, and so then, and maybe they're playing another sport. Maybe I'm a volleyball player, but it's also, it overlaps with something else, and that happens.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my gosh, no wonder we got a problem. So, the communication and some stuff you can't control, but.
And I think another thing with thinking of strength coaches, you have to realize it's great to have that plan, right? You maybe map out a whole year, right? In season, off season, you think you've got this perfect plan, but you have to be willing to adapt it and change it. Like you have to. It's not going to just stay all nice and neat and pretty like you have it organized and planned out on paper. I think, and I think some coaches, not all, they can get stuck in wanting to just do it exactly how it's planned out, and you just can't, because we're complex organisms and there's a lot of factors that can contribute to performance or impaired performance. Well, I don't have too much else. Is there anything else you want to mention? Anything in the lab? Anything exciting? I don't know if you have anything you want to leave with.
Well, we just have a lot of fun here, and it's about sport performance. And so, and the journey to reaching your potential. So we study elite sport performance, but everyone who's elite wasn't always elite. Everybody started as a beginner, as an untrained person, and they have their journey. So we just have a lot of fun, and we have an open door. People can reach out to us, and or if you're on KU's campus, we're in the Robinson Center, and so we do have a lot of fun.
So how can people contact you if they have questions about the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab, your research, or your teaching activities?
Well, there's a couple ways. My email is acfry@ku.edu, and that will come directly to me. Also, you can follow our lab on our social media platforms on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or on LinkedIn to keep track of some of the things that we're doing in our lab.
Well, thanks for coming on the show again today, Dr. Fry. If you have questions for me about the KU Exercise Science program, you can email me, jtaylor@ku.edu, or you can call me at 913-897-8516. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Thanks again for watching.